The sleek F-15 Eagles screamed across the tarmac at Bagram Airfield, their twin engines roaring with the kind of power that made everyone stop and stare. The pilots who climbed out of those cockpits carried themselves with the swagger that came from flying the most advanced air superiority fighters in the world. They were the elite, the best of the best, and they knew it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But across the flight line sat something that made them smirk and shake their heads, a battered UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter that had seen better days, much better days. The paint was faded, the metal showed patches where repairs had been made, and everything about it screamed old school in a world of cutting-edge technology. To these F-15 pilots, it represented everything they'd moved beyond slow, vulnerable, and frankly, outdated. What they didn't know was that the quiet woman who climbed out of that helicopter's cockpit carried with her a story that would humble every single one of them. Her name was Captain Sarah Chun, and while her aircraft might not have looked like much, the small blue ribbon with white stars that she kept carefully stored in her personal effects told a story of courage that few would ever comprehend. The mockery started almost immediately. "Hey, Chun," called out Major Rick Harrison, one of the more vocal F-15 pilots. "You sure that thing's going to make it back to base? Looks like it belongs in a museum." The laughter that followed was the kind that cut deep, the casual cruelty of people who believed their own hype. Another pilot, Lieutenant Colonel James Weber, joined in. "Maybe we should escort you back. Make sure you don't fall out of the sky." Sarah said nothing. She never did. She simply secured her helmet, performed her post-flight checks, and walked away with the kind of dignity that comes from knowing your own worth doesn't depend on what others think. But her silence only seemed to encourage them more. They saw it as weakness, as an inability to defend herself or her aircraft. What they couldn't see was the weight she carried. Not just the physical weight of her gear, but the emotional weight of memories that most people pray they'll never have to bear. 3 years earlier, in a dusty valley in Afghanistan, Sarah had made a choice that would haunt her forever and simultaneously define her as one of the bravest individuals to ever serve in the United States military. The F-15 pilots had their own stories, of course. They'd flown combat missions, engaged enemy aircraft, and returned home with tales of aerial victories that made for great bar stories. But their fights happened at 30,000 feet, in aircraft designed to keep them safe while they delivered precision strikes. They were warriors, absolutely, but they were warriors who fought from positions of overwhelming technological superiority. Sarah's war had been different. Her war had been fought at treetop level, in an aircraft that had no armor to speak of, no advanced countermeasures, and no ability to outrun anything faster than a motorcycle. Her war had been about putting herself between danger and the people who needed her help, regardless of the cost. The Black Hawk helicopter, for all its perceived shortcomings, had been her weapon of choice, not because it was the best, but because it was what the mission required. While the F-15 pilots flew missions measured in hours, Sarah had spent weeks in contested airspace, ferrying supplies, evacuating wounded, and providing support to ground forces who depended on her for their very survival. But none of that mattered to the pilots who saw only an old helicopter and a quiet woman who wouldn't fight back when they made their jokes. They saw her as an easy target, someone who represented everything they believed they'd evolved beyond. To them, she was a relic of a simpler time, when warfare was messier, more personal, and less technologically advanced. The irony was almost cruel. Here were pilots who prided themselves on their elite status, their advanced training, and their sophisticated equipment, and they were using that position to mock someone whose courage dwarfed their own. They were like children playing with toys, making fun of someone who had actually fought in the wars they only read about in briefings. Sarah's helicopter might have been old, but it had character. Every dent, every scratch, every faded section of paint told a story of missions flown under impossible conditions. It was a machine that had been tested in the crucible of real combat, not just the controlled environment of training exercises and scripted scenarios. The woman who flew it had been tested too, in ways that would have broken most people. She had faced impossible choices, made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for herself and others. And she had emerged from those experiences with a quiet strength that few could understand, but understanding would come. Eventually, inevitably, the truth would surface, and when it did, it would change everything. The mockery would turn to respect, the laughter to silence, and the casual cruelty to something approaching reverence. Because some stories are too powerful to remain hidden forever, and some acts of courage are too extraordinary to be dismissed by those who have never truly been tested. The change would begin that very evening, in the most unexpected of places. Mess hall, where their casual cruelty had become a nightly entertainment. But tonight would be different. Tonight, someone would finally speak up, and the comfortable world of the F-15 pilots would begin to crumble around them. The mess hall at Bagram Airfield was always crowded during the evening meal, filled with the constant chatter of hundreds of service members unwinding after another day in a war zone. The F-15 pilots had claimed their usual table near the back, where they could hold court and regale anyone within earshot with stories of their latest missions. Tonight was no different, except that their favorite topic of conversation had shifted. From their own exploits to the continued mockery of Captain Sarah Chun and her antique helicopter. "I'm telling you," Major Harrison was saying, gesturing with his fork for emphasis, "that thing is held together with duct tape and prayer. I saw the maintenance crew working on it yesterday, and they looked like they were performing surgery on a museum piece." The table erupted in laughter, drawing glances from nearby diners who weren't sure whether to be amused or annoyed by the noise. Lieutenant Colonel Weber leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You know what I heard? Command is thinking about grounding those old birds. About time, if you ask me. We're fighting a 21st century war with 20th century equipment." More laughter, more casual cruelty disguised as professional concern. What they didn't notice was the gradual quieting of the conversations around them. What they didn't see was the way other service members were beginning to look at them with something approaching disgust. What they didn't understand was that their target wasn't just any helicopter pilot. She was someone whose reputation preceded her in ways they couldn't imagine. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a crew chief who worked on multiple aircraft types, had been listening to their conversation with growing irritation. Finally, she'd had enough. "You know," she said loudly enough for several tables to hear, "you boys might want to be careful who you're making fun of." The F-15 pilots turned to look at her, their expressions showing the kind of dismissive amusement that came from being interrupted by someone they considered beneath their notice. "I'm sorry," Major Harrison said with exaggerated politeness. "Did we disturb your dinner? We were just having a professional discussion about aircraft readiness." His tone made it clear that he didn't consider her opinion worth hearing, let alone considering. Rodriguez stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Professional discussion? Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like a bunch of hotshot pilots talking trash about someone who's done more for this war than all of you combined." The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter, with more and more people turning to watch the confrontation develop. "Oh, come on," Weber interjected. "We're not talking trash. We're just saying that maybe it's time to upgrade from helicopters that were old when our fathers were flying them. Nothing personal against Chun, she seems nice enough, but facts." "Are facts? Facts?" Rodriguez's voice was rising now, her anger becoming more apparent. "You want facts? Here's a fact. That woman you're making fun of, that antique helicopter you're laughing at, they've saved more lives than you'll ever know. While you're up there playing video games at 30,000 feet, she's been down in the dirt, pulling people out of situations that would make you cry for your mothers. The F-15 pilots exchanged glances, their amusement beginning to fade as they realized they'd stumbled into something bigger than they'd anticipated. Other service members were openly staring now, and the atmosphere in the mess hall had shifted from casual dining to something approaching a confrontation. "Look," Harrison said, trying to regain control of the situation. "We're all on the same team here. We're just saying that technology advances, and maybe it's time to..." "Time to what?" The voice came from behind them, and they turned to see Master Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, a career soldier whose weathered face and steady demeanor commanded respect throughout the base. Time to mock a Medal of Honor recipient? Time to make jokes about someone who single-handedly saved an entire platoon while under enemy fire? Time to show everyone here just how little you know about the people you're serving with. The words hit the table like a physical blow. Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for valor in the United States military, awarded to fewer than 3,500 people in the nation's history. Suddenly, the laughter died completely, replaced by a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. That's not possible," Weber stammered, his face pale. "We would have known. There would have been ceremonies, announcements." Mitchell's expression was stern, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Some people don't make a big deal about their decorations, son. Some people just do their jobs and don't need everyone to know how heroic they are. Captain Chen is one of those people. She's been flying missions in that antique helicopter for 3 years, and she's never once mentioned what she did to earn that medal." The F-15 pilots sat in stunned silence, their world suddenly turned upside down. Everything they thought they knew about their quiet colleague, everything they'd assumed about her and her aircraft, everything they'd used to justify their mockery, it was all wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. "What did she do?" Harrison asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "That's not my story to tell. But I'll say this, if you want to understand what real courage looks like, you might want to stop looking at your aircraft and start looking at the person flying it. Because that woman has more bravery in her little finger than most people have in their entire bodies." With that, he walked away, leaving the F-15 pilots to confront the uncomfortable reality of their own ignorance. But their education was just beginning, and before the night was over, they would learn exactly what their colleague had done to earn the nation's highest honor for valor. The revelation hit the F-15 pilots like a physical blow, leaving them staring at their half-eaten meals in stunned silence. Medal of Honor, the words echoed in their minds, carrying with them the weight of everything they'd said, every joke they'd made, every casual dismissal of a woman who had been awarded the nation's highest honor for valor. The mess hall around them had returned to its normal volume, but their table remained an island of uncomfortable quiet. Major Harrison pushed his food around his plate, his appetite completely gone. "We need to find out what happened," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to know what she did." The others nodded in agreement, each lost in their own thoughts about how badly they'd misjudged their colleague. Lieutenant Colonel Weber was the first to pull out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he searched for information. "Medal of Honor recipients," he muttered, scrolling through lists and databases. "There's got to be something... But official records were often sparse on details, designed more for documentation than storytelling. It was Rodriguez who provided the first real clue. She had returned to their table, her earlier anger replaced by something that looked like pity. "If you really want to know," she said, "talk to the crew chiefs who worked on her bird when she first got here. They know. They've always known." She paused, studying their faces. "But understand this, when you learn what she did, you're going to feel a lot worse about yourselves than you do right now." The warning didn't deter them. If anything, it made them more determined to understand the magnitude of their mistake. They spent the rest of the evening tracking down people who had served with Chun, people who had been stationed at the same bases, people who might have heard the story. What they found was a conspiracy of silence, not the malicious kind, but the protective kind that surrounds people who have been through something extraordinary. Finally, they found someone willing to talk. Chief Warrant Officer Danny Sullivan had been Chen's co-pilot during her first deployment, and after several drinks and considerable persuasion, he agreed to tell them what had happened in that valley in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. They found a quiet corner of the NCO club, away from prying ears and curious eyes, where Sullivan could speak freely about events that had haunted him for years. "You have to understand," Sullivan began, his voice heavy with memory. "It wasn't supposed to be our mission. We were just supposed to be backup, flying cover for the primary aircraft. But sometimes the war has other plans." He paused, staring into his drink, as if the amber liquid might contain answers to questions he'd been carrying for years. There was a platoon, 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company. They'd been cut off for 6 days. Taliban had them pinned down in a valley with no way out. Every attempt to reach them had failed. The terrain was too rough for ground vehicles, the enemy fire too intense for a normal extraction. Command was talking about writing them off, declaring them Kier, and moving on. The F-15 pilots listened in absolute silence, beginning to understand that they were about to hear something that would change their perspective forever. "Chun volunteered for the mission," Sullivan continued. "Not just volunteered, she fought for it. She studied the terrain, calculated the risks, and convinced command that she could get in and out with that old Black Hawk. Everyone thought she was crazy. The aircraft wasn't designed for that kind of operation. The conditions were impossible, and the enemy presence was overwhelming." He took another sip of his drink, gathering strength to continue. "But she had a plan. She always had a plan. She knew that helicopter better than anyone else knew their own aircraft. She knew exactly what it could do, what it couldn't do, and what it might be able to do if pushed beyond its limits. The insertion was the easy part," Sullivan said, his voice growing quieter. "We went in at night, using terrain masking to avoid detection. The pickup zone was about the size of a basketball court, surrounded by cliffs and enemy positions. We had maybe 30 seconds to get the wounded loaded before the Taliban figured out where we were." The F-15 pilots were hanging on every word, now their earlier mockery seeming like a distant memory from someone else's life. "Everything went wrong," Sullivan continued. "The intelligence was bad, the enemy was ready for us, and the LZ was smaller than we'd been told. We took fire from 3 different directions the moment we touched down. The aircraft was hit multiple times, hydraulic fluid everywhere, warning lights flashing like a Christmas tree." He paused again, and when he continued, his voice was barely audible. "That's when Chun made the decision that started earning her that medal. She could have aborted. Should have aborted. The aircraft was damaged, we were taking heavy fire, and the smart play was to get out of there and try again later. But she knew there wouldn't be a later. She knew that if we left those soldiers behind, they weren't going to make it through another night. So she stayed," Sullivan said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and grief. "She kept that damaged helicopter on the ground while we loaded 13 wounded soldiers. 13 men who would have died if she hadn't been willing to risk everything to save them. The enemy fire was so intense that pieces of the aircraft were falling off around us, but she never moved, never flinched, never gave up." The F-15 pilots sat in stunned silence, beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what they were hearing. This wasn't just a story about courage. It was a story about the kind of heroism that most people only read about in books. "And that's just the beginning," Sullivan said quietly, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "The real story, the part that earned her that Medal of Honor, is what happened during the flight out. The extraction was supposed to be the easy part. Get the wounded loaded, get airborne, and get the hell out of there. But that old Black Hawk, the one the F-15 pilots had been making jokes about, had other ideas. The damage from the ground. Fire was worse than they'd initially thought. The hydraulic system was failing, the tail rotor was damaged, and they were losing power faster than Chun could compensate. Sullivan's voice grew more strained as he continued the story. The F-15 pilots, hanging on every word. But the worst part wasn't the aircraft. It was the soldiers we just loaded. 13 men, and more than half of them were critical. They needed immediate medical attention, the kind you can only get in a field hospital, not some forward aid station. Every minute we spent in the air was a minute closer to losing them. The F-15 pilots had gone completely silent, their drinks forgotten, their earlier confidence shattered by the realization of what they were hearing. This wasn't just a story about military heroism, it was a story about someone who had been forced to choose between her own survival and the lives of 13 strangers. Chun had a choice, Sullivan said, his voice barely above a whisper. She could try to make it to the nearest friendly base, about 40 minutes away with an aircraft that might not stay airborne for 40 seconds. Or she could put us down in hostile territory and wait for backup that might never come. Either way, people were going to die. He took another drink, his hands shaking slightly. But she found a third option. She always found a third option. She knew there was a small American outpost about 15 minutes away, but it was surrounded by Taliban positions and had no real landing zone. The airstrip was basically a patch of dirt between two buildings, barely long enough for a helicopter to set down. That's when she made the decision that separated her from everyone else, Sullivan continued. She decided to try for the outpost, knowing that if she miscalculated by even a few feet, we'd crash and everyone would die. But she also knew that if she succeeded, those 13 soldiers would have a chance. The F-15 pilots could barely breathe. As they listened to the story unfold, they were beginning to understand that their colleague, the quiet woman they'd been mocking, had faced a situation that would have destroyed most people. And she had not only survived it, but had done so with a grace and courage that defied comprehension. The approach was impossible, Sullivan said, his voice growing stronger as he relived the memory. We were flying a damaged aircraft into a landing zone that was too small, surrounded by enemy positions with no room for error. The margin for success was so narrow that most pilots wouldn't have even attempted it. But Chen wasn't most pilots. He looked directly at the F-15 pilots, his eyes carrying the weight of everything he'd witnessed. I've flown with a lot of people over the years, and I've seen some incredible things. But what I saw that day, it wasn't just skill. It wasn't just training. It was something deeper than that. It was the kind of courage that comes from knowing that failure isn't an option, because too many people are depending on you. She brought that helicopter down in a space that was barely large enough for it to fit, Sullivan continued. The landing was so precise that the rotor blades missed the buildings by inches. The wounded were offloaded and in the hands of medics within minutes. 13 lives saved because one woman refused to accept that the situation was impossible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But that's still not the end of the story, Sullivan said, and the F-15 pilots felt their hearts sink as they realized there was more. The aircraft was too damaged to take off again. We were stranded in a hostile area with no way out except on foot. Chun had saved 13 lives, but she'd also trapped herself and her crew in enemy territory. The silence that followed was deafening. The F-15 pilots were beginning to understand that their mockery hadn't just been misguided. It had been cruel in ways they couldn't have imagined. They had been making jokes about someone who had willingly sacrificed her own safety to save others. Someone who had faced impossible choices and had somehow found the strength to make the right ones. What happened next? Major Harrison asked quietly, his voice barely audible. Sullivan looked at him for a long moment, his expression growing even more serious. That's when the real story begins. Because saving those 13 soldiers was just the first part of what Chun did that day. The part that earned her the Medal of Honor happened during the 36 hours that followed, when the Taliban decided they were going to eliminate everyone at that outpost, including us. The F-15. Pilots exchanged glances, realizing that everything they'd heard so far was just the prelude to something even more extraordinary. They were about to learn what it really meant to be a hero, and they were about to understand why the quiet woman they'd been mocking carried herself with such dignity, despite their casual cruelty. You want to know what real courage looks like? Sullivan asked, echoing the words of Master Sergeant Mitchell from earlier that evening. You want to understand what it means to be willing to sacrifice everything for people you've never met? Then listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about everything. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The outpost where we landed wasn't much more than a reinforced building and a few defensive positions. The outpost where they had landed wasn't much more than a reinforced building and a few defensive positions. Maybe 30 soldiers holding a strategic position that controlled access to the entire valley. They'd been under siege for weeks, and the arrival of Chun's damaged helicopter didn't exactly improve their situation. Sullivan's words came slowly now, as if he was pulling each one from a deep well of memory that he'd tried to seal away. The Taliban knew we were there. They knew we couldn't leave. And they knew that if they could overrun the outpost, they'd eliminate not just the garrison but also the crew of the helicopter that had been causing them so much trouble. So they decided to end it all in one coordinated attack. The F-15 pilots sat transfixed, beginning to understand that the story they were hearing was about to become even more incredible than they'd imagined. Their colleague hadn't just saved 13 lives. She had become trapped in a situation that most people would consider a death sentence. The attack started at dawn, Sullivan continued. Mortar, small arms fire, coordinated assaults from 3 different directions. The Taliban threw everything they had at us. The outpost commander, Captain Martinez, told us to find cover and stay out of the way. He said his men would handle the defense while we waited for extraction. Sullivan's voice grew quieter, more intense, but Chun had other ideas. She looked at the situation and realized that the outpost didn't have enough men to hold all their positions. The Taliban had superior numbers and better positions. Without help, everyone was going to die: the original garrison, the wounded soldiers we brought in, and us. So she made another impossible decision, Sullivan said, his voice filled with awe even years later. She decided to join the fight. Not as a pilot waiting for rescue, but as a soldier defending a position that had to be held at all costs. The F-15 pilots could barely comprehend what they were hearing. Military pilots, especially helicopter pilots, weren't infantry soldiers. They were trained to fly aircraft, not to engage in ground combat. The idea of a pilot voluntarily joining a firefight was almost unthinkable. Chun grabbed an M4 rifle and took position on the eastern wall, Sullivan continued. She'd never been trained for that kind of combat, but she learned fast. The Taliban kept coming in waves, and she kept firing, covering sectors that the regular soldiers couldn't reach. She was completely exposed, taking fire from multiple directions, but she never left her position. He took another drink, his hands steadier now that he was deep in the story. The battle lasted for 18 hours. 18 hours of constant fighting, with no relief, no backup, and no hope of extraction. The Taliban had us surrounded, and they were willing to take as many casualties as necessary to eliminate us. But Chun ... she was something else, entirely. She moved from position to position throughout the outpost, wherever the fighting was heaviest. When the western wall was being overrun, she was there. When the main gate was about to fall, she was there. She seemed to be everywhere at once, always appearing wherever the situation was most desperate. Sullivan's voice grew stronger as he relived the memory. But it wasn't just her fighting ability that made the difference. It was her leadership. She wasn't the ranking officer that was Captain Martinez, but she had something that made everyone around her fight harder. She had this calm presence in the middle of chaos, this absolute certainty that they were going to survive no matter what. The F-15 pilots were beginning to understand that they had been in the presence of something extraordinary, something that they had been too blind to recognize. Their colleague wasn't just a pilot, she was a warrior in the truest sense of the word. The second day was worse, Sullivan continued. The Taliban had brought in reinforcements overnight, and they were determined to end the siege. They hit us with everything they had: mortar, rockets, coordinated infantry assaults. The outpost was taking serious damage, and we were running low on ammunition. That's when Chun made her final impossible decision, Sullivan said, his voice growing somber. She realized that the only way to break the siege was to eliminate the Taliban command post, which was located in a fortified position about half a mile from the outpost. It was a suicide mission crossing open ground under enemy fire, assaulting a heavily defended position with no support. The F-15 pilots felt their hearts sink as they realized where the story was heading. Their colleague hadn't just risked her life to save others, she had voluntarily undertaken a mission that had no reasonable chance of success. She volunteered for the mission, Sullivan said quietly. Not just volunteered, she insisted on it. She said that since she was the one who had gotten everyone into this situation, she was the one who needed to get them out of it. Captain Martinez tried to stop her, but she was determined. She took 2 soldiers with her Sergeant First Class, Rodriguez and Corporal Thompson, and they set out across that open ground at night. The Taliban were waiting for them. They knew someone would eventually try to assault their position, and they were ready. Sullivan's voice grew strained as he approached the climax of the story. What happened next? It's the reason she wears that medal. It's the reason she's still alive. And it's the reason that 13 soldiers went home to their families instead of coming back in flag-draped coffins. The F-15 pilots sat in complete silence, their earlier mockery seeming like a distant memory from another lifetime. They were about to learn what it really meant to be a hero, and they were about to understand why their colleague carried herself with such quiet dignity, despite everything she had endured. Sullivan took a deep breath, preparing to tell them about the moment that would define Sarah Chun forever. The assault on the Taliban command post was supposed to be a 3-person operation. Chun, Rodriguez, and Thompson were going to move together, coordinate their attack, and hope for the best. But as they approached the target, Chun realized that the enemy had anticipated their plan. Sullivan's voice dropped to almost a whisper as he reached the heart of the story, the moment that would define Sarah Chun's legacy forever. The Taliban had set up overlapping fields of fire, multiple defensive positions, and enough fighters to repel any reasonable assault. It was a trap, and Chun knew it. She also knew that if they proceeded with the original plan, all 3 of them would die, and the siege would continue until everyone at the outpost was dead. The F-15 pilots could barely breathe as they listened to the story unfold. They were beginning to understand that their colleague had faced a situation that would have broken most people, and she had somehow found the strength to make the impossible choice. So she changed the plan, Sullivan continued. Without telling Rodriguez or Thompson, she decided to create a diversion. She told them to wait for her signal, then assault the command post from the east while she attacked from the west. What she didn't tell them was that her attack was really a sacrifice. The words hit the F-15 pilots like physical blows. They were starting to understand that their mockery hadn't just been misguided. It had been directed at someone who had been willing to die to save others. Chun's assault was a 1-person suicide mission, Sullivan said. his voice growing stronger. With emotion. She knew that if she could draw the Taliban's fire, Rodriguez and Thompson would have a chance to reach the command post and eliminate the leadership. She knew that her attack would probably kill her, but she also knew that without it, everyone would die. So she charged, Sullivan said, and the simple words carried the weight of everything that had happened. She charged a fortified position, defended by at least 20 enemy fighters, knowing that she would almost certainly die in the process. She drew their fire, absorbed their attention, and created the opportunity that Rodriguez and Thompson needed. The F-15 pilot sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they were hearing. Their colleague, the quiet woman they'd been mocking, had voluntarily undertaken a mission that was essentially suicide, and she had done it to save people she barely knew. The diversionary attack worked, Sullivan continued. While the Taliban were focused on Chun, Rodriguez and Thompson were able to reach the command post and eliminate the leadership. The enemy resistance collapsed almost immediately, and the siege was broken. But Chun... He paused, and the F-15 pilots felt their hearts stop as they waited for the conclusion of the story. Chun was hit 7 times during her assault, Sullivan said quietly, 7 times. She should have died instantly, but somehow she kept fighting. She kept drawing fire, kept creating opportunities for her teammates, kept refusing to give up until the mission was complete. When the fighting was over, when the Taliban had retreated and the siege was lifted, they found Chun unconscious in a shell crater about 50 yards from the enemy command post. She was covered in blood, barely breathing, and the medics didn't think she would survive the evacuation to the field hospital. The F-15 pilots could barely speak. They were beginning to understand that their colleague hadn't just been a hero, she had been willing to die to save others, and she had somehow survived an experience that should have killed her. She spent 3 months in the hospital, Sullivan continued. 3 months of surgeries, rehabilitation, and recovery. The doctors said it was a miracle that she survived it all, let alone that she was able to return to duty. But she did return. She came back to flying, came back to serving, came back to the same old helicopter that you've been making jokes about. Sullivan looked directly at the F-15 pilots, his eyes carrying the weight of everything he'd witnessed. That helicopter isn't just an aircraft to her. It's a reminder of what she's capable of when everything is on the line. It's a symbol of the 13 lives she saved, the siege she broke, and the ultimate sacrifice she was willing to make. And you know what the worst part is? Sullivan asked, his voice growing harder. She never talks about it. She never mentions the medal, never tells the story, never makes anyone feel bad for not knowing what she's done. She just goes about her business, flying missions, saving lives, and letting people like you make jokes about her and her aircraft. The F-15 pilots sat in complete silence, their earlier arrogance completely destroyed by the weight of what they'd learned. They had been making fun of someone who embodied everything they claimed to represent: courage, sacrifice, and dedication to duty. So when you see that old helicopter, Sullivan said, finishing his story, remember that it's not just a machine. It's a testament to what one person can accomplish when they're willing to risk everything for others. And when you see Captain Chun, remember that she's not just a pilot. She's someone who has faced the ultimate test of courage and has emerged stronger for it. The F-15 pilots nodded in stunned silence, finally understanding the magnitude of their mistake and the true character of the woman they had so badly misjudged. But their education was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new realizations, and the beginning of a transformation that would change them forever. Tomorrow did indeed bring new challenges, new realizations, and the beginning of a transformation that would change the F-15 pilots forever. The night following Sullivan's revelation had been sleepless for all of them, filled with replaying every joke, every casual dismissal, Every moment of cruelty they had directed at someone who had demonstrated more courage in a single day than they had shown in their entire careers. Major Harrison found himself unable to sleep, lying awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with images from Sullivan's story. He kept imagining Chun charging that enemy position, knowing she would probably die, doing it anyway because 13 lives depended on her courage. The contrast between her sacrifice and his own petty mockery was almost too much to bear. Lieutenant Colonel Weber was no better. He had prided himself on being a professional, a leader who understood the importance of respect and military bearing. But his treatment of Captain Chun had been anything but professional. He had allowed his prejudices about older equipment to cloud his judgment about the person who operated it, and the realization of his failure was eating away at him like acid. The other F-15 pilots were equally affected. They had been part of a group that had systematically mocked and dismissed someone who embodied everything they claimed to value. They had been warriors making fun of a warrior, soldiers belittling a soldier, and the hypocrisy of it was almost unbearable. But perhaps the worst part was the realization that their behavior had been noticed by everyone else on the base. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's confrontation in the mess hall hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the culmination of weeks of growing disgust from other service members who knew the truth about Captain Chun, but had watched in silence as the F-15 pilots made fools of themselves. As dawn broke over Bagram Airfield, Harrison made a decision. "We have to make this right," he said when the others gathered for their morning briefing. "We can't just pretend this never happened and hope it goes away. We owe her an apology, and we owe it to ourselves to be better than this." The others nodded in agreement, but the question remained: how do you apologize to someone for mocking their service when that service included actions that had earned the Medal of Honor? How do you explain that you didn't know when not knowing was itself a failure of character and professionalism? Weber had been doing research of his own, trying to understand the full scope of what Chun had accomplished. The official records were sparse, but he had found enough information to understand that the story Sullivan had told them was actually a condensed version of events that had been even more extraordinary than they'd realized. She was recommended for the Medal of Honor by 17 different people, Weber told the group during their impromptu meeting. 17. Not just her immediate command, but soldiers from 3 different units who had been affected by her actions. The citation mentions conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. But those are just words. What she actually did. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The official language couldn't capture the reality of what Chun had done, the impossible choices she had made, the ultimate sacrifice she had been willing to make for people she barely knew. "The thing is," Harrison said quietly, "she's been here for months. She's been flying missions, working alongside us, and we never bothered to get to know her. We never bothered to ask about her background, her experience, her service record. We just saw an old helicopter and made assumptions." The realization was particularly galling because it revealed something ugly about their own characters. They had been so focused on their own superiority, so convinced of their own importance, that they had failed to recognize true greatness when it was right in front of them. "I keep thinking about the way she handled our mockery," Weber said. "She never fought back, never got angry, never tried to defend herself. She just took it, with dignity. Like she knew something we didn't." "She did know something we didn't," Harrison replied. "She knew what real courage looked like. She knew what it meant to be tested under impossible circumstances. And she knew that our opinions didn't matter because she had already proven herself in ways we couldn't even imagine." The F-15 pilots were beginning to understand that their colleagues' quiet dignity hadn't been weakness, it had been strength. She had faced their mockery with the same calm resolve that had carried her through combat. The same unshakable inner certainty that had allowed her to make impossible choices under impossible circumstances. "We need to approach her," Harrison said finally. "Not as a group, that would be intimidating and probably seem insincere. But we need to acknowledge what we've done and try to make amends." The others agreed, but they all knew that any apology would be inadequate. How do you apologize for failing to recognize heroism? How do you explain that you didn't know about someone's service record when that ignorance was itself a form of disrespect? "Maybe the apology isn't the most important thing," Weber suggested. "Maybe the most important thing is changing how we behave going forward. Maybe the best way to honor her service is to be better officers, better people, better representatives of the military values we claim to embody." It was a sobering thought, but an accurate one. Their mockery of Chun had revealed something ugly about their own characters, something that needed to be addressed not just with words, but with actions. They needed to become the kind of officers who would never make such mistakes again. Conversation was interrupted by the sound of helicopter rotors spinning up across the flight line. Chun was preparing for another mission. The sound of helicopter rotors spinning up across the flight line drew the F-15 pilots to the window of their briefing room. Captain Chun was preparing for another mission, and for the first time since they'd arrived at Bagram, they found themselves watching her with new eyes that had been opened to the truth of who she really was. "She's flying a mission today," Harrison said, checking the flight schedule. "Transport run to one of the forward bases. Maybe we could I don't know. Be there when she gets back? Show some respect for once." The others nodded, knowing that it was a small gesture, but hoping it might be a start. They had a lot of work to do to repair the damage they had caused, both to their relationship with Chun and to their own reputations among their fellow service members. They made their way to the flight line, where Chun was conducting her pre-flight inspection with the same methodical precision she had always shown. But now, watching her work, the F-15 pilots were struck by details they had never noticed before. The way she moved around her aircraft wasn't just professional, it was almost reverential. Every check, every adjustment, every moment of preparation was performed with the kind of care that spoke to a deep understanding of the machine and its capabilities. "Look at her," Weber said quietly. "She knows that helicopter better than we know our own aircraft, every bolt, every wire, every system. She's not just flying it, she's partnering with it." It was true. Chun's relationship with her aircraft was unlike anything they had observed before. She didn't just operate the helicopter, she communicated with it, understood its moods and quirks, and trusted it with her life in ways that went far beyond normal pilot-aircraft relationships. "That's what happens when you've been through what she's been through," Harrison replied. "When that machine is the difference between life and death, not just for you but for everyone you're responsible for, you develop a connection that goes beyond mere professionalism." They watched as Chun completed her inspection and climbed into the cockpit. Even from a distance, they could see the way she settled into her seat, the way her hands moved across the controls with practiced ease, the way she seemed to become one with the machine she was about to fly. "She's not just a pilot," Weber said, voicing a realization that had been growing in his mind. "She's an artist. Flying isn't just her job, it's her calling. And that old helicopter isn't just her aircraft, it's her instrument." The Black Hawk's engines began to spin up, and the familiar sound that the F-15 pilots had dismissed as inferior suddenly took on new meaning. It wasn't the roar of raw power that characterized their own aircraft. It was something more subtle, more complex. It was the sound of a machine that had been carefully maintained, lovingly tended, and trusted with impossible missions. As the helicopter lifted off, the F-15 pilots found themselves watching with new eyes. The takeoff wasn't just a demonstration of mechanical capability, it was a display of artistry. Chun's control inputs were so smooth, so precise, that the aircraft seemed to float rather than fly. Every movement was purposeful, every adjustment calculated. Every moment of the flight a testament to the skill and experience of the pilot. "My God," Harrison whispered. "She's not just flying that thing, she's dancing with it." It was true. Chun's flight wasn't just transportation, it was a demonstration of the kind of mastery that comes from years of experience, months of combat, and countless hours of training. She wasn't just operating a helicopter, she was conducting a symphony of mechanical precision and human skill. As they watched the Black Hawk disappear into the distance, the F-15 pilots were struck by the realization that they had been witnessing something extraordinary every day without recognizing it. Chun's flights weren't just routine missions, they were displays of expertise that they had been too blind to appreciate. "We need to be here when she gets back," Weber said. "Not to apologize, not yet, but to show respect. To acknowledge what we've been too stupid to see." The wait for Chun's return seemed to stretch on forever. The F-15 pilots found themselves checking the time constantly, watching the sky, and feeling increasingly nervous about the confrontation they knew was coming. They had rehearsed various approaches, different ways of acknowledging their mistake, but nothing seemed adequate. Other personnel on the base were watching too, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. The story of the F-15 pilot's discovery had spread throughout the installation, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about what should happen next. Some were sympathetic, understanding that mistakes happen and that good people can learn from their errors. Others were less forgiving, believing that the mockery had revealed something fundamental about the character of the men involved. When Chun's helicopter finally appeared on the horizon, the F-15 pilots felt their hearts begin to race. This was it, the moment when they would have to confront their colleague and somehow find a way to acknowledge the magnitude of their mistake. The Black Hawk's approach was as masterful as its departure had been. Chun brought the aircraft in with the kind of precision that made it look effortless, settling onto the landing pad with barely a whisper of contact. The engines spun down gradually, and after a few moments, the cockpit door opened. Chun climbed out of her aircraft with the same quiet dignity she had always shown, seemingly unaware of the attention she was receiving. She began her post-flight inspection with the same methodical care that characterized all her actions, checking systems, securing equipment, and preparing the helicopter for its next mission. The F-15 pilots watched in silence, struck by the realization that they were observing someone who had dedicated her entire career to excellence, someone who approached every aspect of her service with the kind of commitment that they had claimed to value but had failed to recognize. "She's not doing this for show," Harrison said quietly. "She's doing this because it's who she is. This is how she's always been, and this is how she'll always be, whether anyone is watching or not." It was a humbling realization, and it made their approaching apology seem even more necessary, and even more inadequate. The moment of truth arrived sooner than the F-15 pilots had expected. As Captain Chun finished securing her helicopter and began walking toward the operations building, Major Harrison found himself stepping forward, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and determination. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, but now that it was actually happening, all his carefully planned words seemed to evaporate. "Captain Chun," he called out, his voice carrying across the tarmac. Could we speak with you for a moment?" Chun turned, her expression neutral and professional. There was no anger in her eyes, no accusation, no hint of the emotional turmoil that the F-15 pilots had been experiencing. She simply nodded and walked over to where they were standing, her posture relaxed and her manner calm. "What can I do for you, Major?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. It was the same tone she had always used with them, the same professional courtesy that had characterized all their interactions. But now, knowing what they knew, the F-15 pilots could hear something else in her voice, a careful neutrality that suggested she was prepared for whatever they might say. Harrison struggled to find the right words. How do you begin a conversation like this? How do you acknowledge that you've been making fun of someone who had risked her life to save others? How do you explain that you didn't know about her service record when that ignorance was itself form of disrespect? We learned about your Medal of Honor, he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. We learned about what you did in Afghanistan, about the siege, about the soldiers you saved. And we want you to know that we're sorry. We're sorry for the jokes, for the comments about your helicopter, for not showing you the respect you deserved. Chun's expression didn't change. She listened to his words with the same calm attention she brought to everything else, but there was no indication of how she was receiving the apology. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, and Harrison found himself wondering if he had said too much or too little. We were wrong, Lieutenant Colonel Weber added, stepping forward to join the conversation. We made assumptions about you and your aircraft based on appearance rather than performance. We let our prejudices cloud our judgment, and we failed to recognize excellence when it was right in front of us. Still, Chun said nothing. She simply stood there listening, her expression unchanged. The F-15 pilots were beginning to understand that their colleagues' silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. She was allowing them to speak, to acknowledge their mistakes, to confront the consequences of their actions. The thing is, Harrison continued, we realize now that we don't just owe you an apology. We owe you our respect. What you did, what you've accomplished, what you continue to do every day, it's everything we claim to value as military officers. You represent the best of what we're supposed to be. Chun finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. I appreciate your apology, she said. But I want you to understand something. I didn't do what I did for recognition. I didn't do it for medals or ceremonies or respect. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because people needed help, and because I was in a position to provide that help. She paused, looking at each of the F-15 pilots in turn. The Medal of Honor is important to me, not because of what it represents about me, but because of what it represents about the people I served with. It's a reminder of the soldiers who didn't make it home, the crews who didn't survive there. Missions, the families who sacrificed everything for their country. The F-15 pilots listened in silence, beginning to understand that their colleague's perspective on her own service was fundamentally different from their own. She didn't see herself as a hero, she saw herself as someone who had been fortunate enough to survive experiences that had claimed others. I don't need your respect because of what I did 3 years ago, Chun continued. I need your respect because of what I do every day. I need your respect because I'm a professional who takes her job seriously, because I'm a pilot who maintains her aircraft to the highest standards, because I'm a soldier who serves her country with honor. Her words hit the F-15 pilots like physical blows. They were beginning to understand that their colleagues' quiet dignity wasn't just a response to their mockery. It was a fundamental part of who she was. She carried herself with honor not because she had won a medal, but because honor was part of her character. You're right, Harrison said quietly. We should have recognized your professionalism from the beginning. We should have seen your dedication, your skill, your commitment to excellence. We should have judged you by your actions, not by the age of your equipment. Chun nodded, her expression softening slightly. Military service isn't about having the newest equipment or the most advanced technology, she said. It's about using whatever tools you have to accomplish the mission, to serve your country, and to take care of the people around you. Sometimes that means flying an old helicopter. Sometimes it means making impossible choices. But it always means doing your best with whatever you have. The F-15 pilots were beginning to understand that their colleague had been teaching them lessons about military service every day, simply by example. They had been too blind to see it, too focused on their own superiority to recognize the quiet excellence that had been right in front of them. We want to do better, Weber said. We want to be better officers, better colleagues, better representatives of the values we're supposed to embody. We want to learn from our mistakes and make sure we never repeat them. Chun smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. Then that's all I can ask for, she said. We all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them and becoming better people because of them. The conversation marked a turning point, but it was only the beginning of a transformation that would take weeks to fully unfold. The conversation with Captain Chin marked a turning point, but it was only the beginning of a transformation that would take weeks to fully unfold. The change that followed went far beyond simple apology or acknowledgement of error. It was profound, affecting not just the F-15 pilots' relationship with their colleague, but their entire approach to military service and their understanding of what it meant to be a professional officer. Major Harrison was the first to make concrete changes to his behavior. He began arriving at the flight line earlier, spending time observing Chun's pre-flight procedures and maintenance protocols. What he discovered was a level of attention to detail that exceeded anything he had previously encountered. Every inspection was thorough, every system check was complete, and every piece of equipment was maintained to standards that went beyond mere regulation compliance. She's not just following the book, he told Weber one morning as they watched Chen work. She's rewriting it. Every procedure, every check, every moment of preparation is performed with the kind of precision that most people reserve for life or death situations. But for her, every flight is a life or death situation. Weber had been making changes of his own. He had begun researching helicopter operations, studying the capabilities and limitations of rotary wing aircraft, and developing an appreciation for the unique challenges that helicopter pilots faced. What he discovered was that flying helicopters, especially in combat conditions, required a completely different skill set from fixed-wing aviation. We were comparing apples to oranges, he admitted. Our aircraft are designed for speed, altitude, and standoff capability. Hers is designed for precision, versatility, and close-quarters operations. We were judging her by our standards, instead of recognizing that she was operating by entirely different and often more demanding criteria. The other F-15 pilots were equally committed to change. They began treating Chun with the respect and professionalism that she had always deserved, but more importantly, they began applying the lessons they had learned from her to their own service. They started paying more attention to maintenance, spending more time on preparation, and approaching their duties with the kind of commitment that Chun had always demonstrated. The transformation wasn't lost on the rest of the base personnel. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been among the first to confront the F-15 pilots about their behavior, noticed the change immediately. It's like they're completely different people, she told her colleagues. They're still confident, still professional, but they're also humble now. They've learned something about what real excellence looks like. The change was particularly evident in the way the F-15 pilots interacted with other personnel. They stopped talking about their own accomplishments and started asking questions about other people's work. They began recognizing the contributions of maintenance crews, support personnel, and logistics specialists. They started understanding that military effectiveness wasn't just about individual heroism, but about the collective efforts of everyone involved. Chun, for her part, seemed to appreciate the change without making a big deal about it. She continued to conduct herself with the same quiet professionalism that had always characterized her service, but she also began to open up slightly to her colleagues. She started sharing technical knowledge, offering advice on maintenance procedures, and occasionally joining conversations that she had previously avoided. She's not just a pilot, Harrison realized one day as he watched Chun working with a maintenance crew. She's a teacher. She's been teaching us lessons about professionalism, excellence, and service from the very beginning. We were just too arrogant to learn. The relationship between the F-15 pilots and Chun gradually evolved from one of mockery and dismissal to one of mutual respect and professional admiration. They began to understand that diversity of equipment and mission didn't mean hierarchy of importance. Chun's helicopter might have been older and less technologically advanced than their fighters, but her skills as a pilot and her dedication to service were every bit as valuable. The change was perhaps most evident during a joint training exercise that took place several months after their initial conversation. The F-15 pilots found themselves working directly with Chun on a complex mission that required close coordination between fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft. What they discovered was that their colleagues' skills were not just adequate, but exceptional. "She's not just keeping up with us," Weber observed during the debriefing. "She's anticipating our needs, coordinating our actions, and making all of us more effective. She's not just a pilot, she's a force multiplier." The exercise also demonstrated something else. The F-15 pilots had become better officers because of their experience with Chun. They were more thoughtful, more professional, and more committed to excellence. They had learned that true military effectiveness wasn't about individual superiority, but about collective capability. As their deployment neared its end, the F-15 pilots realized that their encounter with Captain Chun had been more than just a lesson in humility. It had been a masterclass in what it meant to be a professional military officer. They had learned about courage, dedication, and the importance of recognizing excellence regardless of its packaging. "She changed us," Harrison said during one of their final conversations. "Not just our opinion of her, but our opinion of ourselves. She showed us what we could become if we were willing to set aside our egos and focus on what really mattered." The Medal of Honor that Chun carried wasn't just a recognition of her extraordinary courage in Afghanistan. It was a symbol of the values that she embodied every day: selfless service, personal courage, and unwavering commitment to excellence. The F-15 pilots had learned that true heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about the daily choice to do your best, to serve others, and to maintain your integrity regardless of the circumstances. Their mockery of an old helicopter had taught them something invaluable: that excellence comes in many forms, and that the most important qualities of a military officer, courage, professionalism, and dedication, cannot be measured by the sophistication of the equipment they operate, but by the character they bring to their service. The lesson would stay with them for the rest of their careers. A reminder that sometimes the greatest teachers come in the most unexpected packages, and that true heroism often flies quietly, without fanfare, in aircraft that may look old, but carry crews with hearts of gold. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.